All right, everybody. We're about ready for our next session, the last session of the day, and we are definitely ending the day on a high note. This is a session I personally have been looking forward to for days now. We started today off hearing from Tim Berners-Lee, who truly was a pioneer in getting us going with the World Wide Web, making a huge impact. And now we get a chance to hear from what I consider to be another set of pioneers, but this time it isn't the World Wide Web, it's the blockchain. And we're fortunate enough to have Michael Del Castillo, who is going to moderate this discussion. Michael's a journalist at CoinDesk, where he covers both Bitcoin and blockchain applications, so he's a perfect person to help lead us through this, this fascinating conversation. So without further ado, I will introduce Michael to the stage. Thank you.
Welcome. Thank you. Is there an order?
Cheers?
I don't think so. Hello. My name is Michael Del Castillo. I'm a reporter at CoinDesk. We specialize in covering pretty much anything that can be built on a blockchain or a distributed ledger. I'm excited to be here today with 4 of the leading thinkers in the space who, in their own way, represent 4 different approaches to applying blockchain technology in the real world. We've been encouraged to have a very vivacious conversation on stage here, so please do definitely feel free to jump in with chants and hoots and hollers and claps and boos. It's rare that we have an opportunity to get 4 different perspectives from so high on the totem pole at these different operations. So I really do hope that it gives us an opportunity to really get a high quality view at the industry from the highest levels. To my left is Mr. Vitalik Buterin, who co-founded Ethereum and is the inventor of Ethereum, and identifies on his biography page as what is it, a conservative? There we go. Which I didn't know what that term was. I had to go look it up. Well, go and do a little defining yourself. Sorry, Vitalik. To his left is Mr. Brian Bielendorf. He's the executive director of Hyperledger, a consortium of companies looking to build a variety of blockchain applications using several different implementations, open source, importantly. And to his left, we've got Stefan Thomas, the CTO and co-founder of Ripple, who is one of the people who is responsible for us being here today, and has been working in the space from the Bitcoin days, so has a lot of chops going back to a long time ago. To his left is Mr. Tom Jessup, the president of, I almost said the president of Morgan Stanley. The president of Chain, who comes to the company with a long pedigree of banking resume items. In order to kick things off, I did kind of want to go down the line here and have an opportunity to give each of the speakers not so much an introduction of themselves, but a quick little catch-up on where they are in their own corporations is the wrong word, organizations development, and what sort of sets their strategy apart from the other people on stage. So, Tom, if you could kind of kick us off and just give us a quick little update on where Chain is in its development process, and what do you see as one of the distinguishing traits of the Chain offering that kind of sets it apart from some of the other speakers here?
Sure. I think so Chain, for those of you that don't know the company, was founded in 2014. We're an enterprise blockchain software provider. We have our own protocol called the Chain Protocol. We're lucky that we count a few large financial institutions as our biggest customers. And I think what's interesting about Chain is that going back 2 years now, I think it was the fall of 2015, we implemented our first production network with NASDAQ. So separate and distinct from any other interesting strategies in the space, the company was very focused on quality over quantity and looking to get to production with clients as opposed to a raft of POCs that would effectively prove chops in different verticals, but perhaps not in with anything material in terms of ROI or benefit to the companies that we partner with. On that basis, I think that I think our calling card is that we have a fairly mature technology stack. It's been proven with large organizations, and I think we started as a Bitcoin API company when I think there was some early thought that the public blockchain would be useful for capital markets and other institutional applications. I think that idea was quickly overturned, not only in the community but also among the banks that were starting to look at the technology at the time. And so we have a hardened version of effectively a blockchain software that we deploy with people like Visa, NASDAQ, and Citi. And so from that standpoint, I feel like we're on our third iteration. First is initially as an API company using the public blockchain to a company that's developed an early framework for a private blockchain, and iterating in terms of how we can help customers get to quicker ROI, in some cases without the necessary requirement of a network effect, in which the blockchain would operate. We can talk a bit more about that.
One of the things that all the speakers have in common on stage here, in case you don't know, is that live, real, useful applications have been built using protocols that they either represent or that they helped build. Stefan, coming down the line here, you also sort of had an early, you had early experience in the Bitcoin space that sort of inspired your work with Ripple. Can you kind of walk us through a little bit about your own transition from the early days of what you imagined Ripple would be into what it is now, and how is it that you came to the trajectory that you find yourself on?
Yeah, so I got into the blockchain space back in 2010 and pretty much immediately caught the bug. I thought this was very fascinating technology, it had a huge amount of potential. And so ever since that first day when I sort of imagined what it could be like, I've wanted to see it realized in practice and actually, actual real money moving through it, people really using it, and it having an impact on people's lives. And I remember getting very frustrated going from Bitcoin conference to Bitcoin conference year after year, and there would be a keynote speaker talking about how this year Bitcoin's going to go mainstream, and it never happened, and it just felt like this endless, case of Groundhog Day. And I started to kind of go back, to my apartment and kind of think about like, what does it really take to take something mainstream, and what does it really mean for technology to become widely adopted? And I think the thing that I realized was it was interoperability with the existing systems. You can't build new things in isolation. You can't sit in the ivory tower and imagine the perfect world and just start, laying bricks for that, because you're not going to enable people to come to you and kind of join your vision. And so what really excited me about joining Ripple was this idea of working together with the incumbent financial industry and kind of building something together, making the technology accessible to everybody. And so, recently we announced 100 production committed customers. So that's an incredible milestone for us, and for me personally, as somebody who's always wanted to see this technology realized. So I'm very excited about where we are.
Brian, I'm going to totally skip over you for a second here. Vitalik, if you could also just kind of, for those in the audience who might not understand the distinctions between the different offerings of the people on stage, could you kind of just walk us through what your original vision was for Ethereum, and how what it is today is a little bit different than the offerings that are being offered by the other people here?
Sure. So the original motivation behind Ethereum was very simple, right? So first, at the time when it was created, which was around the end of 2013, people already recognized that blockchains are cool, and blockchains have very nice and interesting properties, and like the ideas of decentralization, transparency, like public auditing, and all of this could be potentially very powerful. But at the time, there was one big major blockchain application that everyone was talking about, which was like Bitcoin payments, and there was an increasing number of people who were thinking, well, why can't the blockchain be used for more than just one application? Right? So if you hear me presenting about Ethereum today, the way that I define a blockchain is I talk about a decentralized computer network with a memory. Right? So that's kind of the core definition of what it is. Like it's abstract away the blocks, abstract away the chains, abstract away the proof of work. Like that's what it does. So once you think about it in those terms, then you realize that this seems like the kind of construction that could potentially be used for a bunch of things. Right? Like we use memory for everything, and we use decentralization for lots of things. We have BitTorrent, the original version of Skype was fairly peer-to-peer. We have like messaging networks, a whole bunch of decentralized things. So if lots of things require decentralization, lots of things require memory, there's got to be a pretty large intersection. And the blockchain technologies that we have now and at the time seem like by far the best tool for providing that intersection. And so you start expanding. One of the first non-Bitcoin blockchain projects that was around was something called Namecoin, which was created back in 2010. Then people started talking about things like colored coins, which was a fairly early protocol for recording other types of digital assets on the blockchain. There was something like called Mastercoin that did financial contracts. And what people were starting to create is what I call a Swiss Army knife protocol. So that basically it's like you get a committee of 10 people come together in a room, they sit and brainstorm, and they come up.
What kind of protocol?
Swiss Army knife protocol.
Swiss Army knife.
Yeah, so basically you have your committee of people come together in a room, brainstorm for an hour, and they come up with 23 different blockchain applications. And they'd come up with a blockchain protocol that had 23 different transaction types. Transaction type 1, issue a currency. Transaction type 2, send a currency. Transaction type 3, enter into an insurance agreement. Transaction type 4, enter into a gambling contract, and so on and so forth. And what I realized is that this approach is just fundamentally limited, right? Like you can do 23 things, then a week after, some teenager in Finland invents thing number 24, and you have to build a new protocol. So the solution that I came up with was instead of doing that, you build a general purpose protocol, a blockchain that understands a programming language. And if you do that, then running a new application inside of Ethereum is going to be basically not like adding an entirely new thing to your Swiss Army knife, but it's more like downloading an app. So, as far as what distinguishes Ethereum from some of the other platforms that are on offer here, one major distinguishing factor is that Ethereum is a public chain, so which means that it's an open network where anyone can participate in terms of reading to it, into the blockchain, in terms of writing to it, so sending transactions, and in terms of managing the consensus. So, whether that's proof of work or proof of stake, both of those mechanisms ultimately allow pretty much anyone to become a miner or a validator. So that's one important aspect, and then the other important aspect is the general purpose components, though I do recognize that other platforms are increasingly adding general purpose elements. I think the main value that open public blockchains provide is that several things. And I'm totally not the sort of person who says that open public blockchains are the only kind that should exist. We have the internet, but we have intranets even today, and they do a lot of good. But it's, the idea that you have, first of all, there are going to be applications that where it just doesn't make sense to make a network for that application. So generally much smaller applications and individual developers. Also, there are going to be, you actually do, for many applications, do want to have a public thing that you do not control be verifying what you're doing. And basically by giving up control in some sense, you are giving people more trust.
So I like the way that you walked into that or approached that question was because it kind of does highlight some of the problems early in the industry of distinguishing between these different offerings. And to a degree, I feel like unless you're really, really deep in the industry and you understand all of the different offerings very intimately, that problem still kind of exists in some ways, which is one of the reasons why I think that the opportunity for to have the four of you on stage today and to speak really clearly about those distinctions could be potentially incredibly valuable. The reason why I briefly skipped over Brian is because Brian's work with Hyperledger is a little bit different than the other three speakers in the fact that in a way he represents multiple blockchains. And has had to wrestle with the inside, from the inside, with the idea of clearly communicating differences between these very, very nuanced protocols. Could you kind of briefly just catch us all up on what is Hyperledger? And as you have seen your three colleagues on stage here kind of define their own unique offerings. What have you experienced in trying to distinguish each of the different protocols within Hyperledger?
Yeah. So if we were sitting here in 2003 and talking about mobile operating systems, we would have a number of people who'd say, we've done this the best possible mobile operating system from the silicon up. We've got something highly targeted to do kind of smart applications on it, and we're going to win. We'd have others who'd say we're going to take a bit more of an open approach, and yet very few people, I think, in those early days were talking about how do we come up with something more standardized, more common. And what it led to was an industry where you have these really stark decisions to make between where you build your applications, right? iOS is very different from Android, and there's a few portability layers, but we ended up with a mobile operating system world, which ended up rewarding a couple of key players right at the center. Compare that to the server operating system world from 10 years prior to that, where you had a lot of different players, but most of them were variants of Unix. A lot of them tried to give lip service to integration. There was the POSIX interface, but what happened was the Linux operating system came around and cleaned up, right? And it cleaned up by having a different approach not by being technologically better, at least at first. At first, Solaris, no question, was better. At other Unixes were better by objective measures. But it won because it had an approach that said these differences might matter today, but they don't matter in the 5 or 10 year horizon. And they also don't matter to people who want to sit above the layer of kind of an abstraction layer, right? They want to be able to deal with technology as if you can, as a black box, with the occasional desire to go kind of white box in, understand how it works, tweak it and evolve it, but that at the end of the day, we just want to treat it like plumbing, right? We want to be able to move on from it. And so the Linux Foundation was formed about 15 years ago in a world where this was 10 years after Linus Torvalds had released his version of the kernel of a Unix operating system. And in that time, major companies had started to build commercial offerings upon it and were fighting to see who could be the Linux company, right? To try to claim that brand, and in a kind of zero-sum game kind of way, went out, right? You also had this challenge where everyone was asking, what happens if Linus is hit by a bus? But also, how does he scale? He very quickly became kind of an air traffic controller to other people's patches, kind of landing in his tree. But there was really a question of how do you have a sense of governance around how the technology is developed, so that really anybody can step up and be a part of that system and build productively on top of it. And in its first 10 years of existence, it really proved out that there was a role for a need for an organization that could sit and balance between not only between developers on the one hand, give them a place and support for being able to build their code, not to pay the developers directly, but to make sure when they did show up, their work was harmonized and focused on the right kinds of challenges. And then on the developers, and then on the business side, how do you keep them from really, destroying the brand by trying to own it, right? That model seemed to scale, and it was a model that paid for itself through a membership model, through sponsorships, not that had any say over the code, right? When somebody like a Dell or an HP or an IBM would join the Linux Foundation, that gave them no special rights to say what went into Linux or anything like that. It said, no, you're part of a consortium that's helping build something bigger than any of us could individually build on our own, and bigger than any of us would want to build on our own. And that model seemed to scale. From that point forward, there were projects in cloud computing, software-defined networking, getting Linux to run in telco spaces inside of cars. And then about 2 years ago, somebody said, there's something interesting going on in this blockchain space and the cryptocurrency space, right? And maybe the Linux Foundation should do something about this. So we did a couple of things. We hosted the Bitcoin Core mailing list. We set that up to try to get to understand the community better. But we came to realize that there were already some interesting foundations out there, the Bitcoin Foundation, the Ethereum Foundation, others that were doing a decent job, it seemed, of answering many of these questions. What went unanswered, though, was the potential for some of the underlying technologies around distributed ledgers and smart contracts to find a potential role as replacements for many of the kind of purposes that people had out there for centralized systems, right? If you could take a marketplace that had an actor at the center of that, like a Swift or a DTCC, and if you could replace this kind of message hub kind of model where they ran the central database and turned that into something that was more, you could say, a distributed database, but more of a multi-party database, one resilient to hostile actors, but one still based on the premise that these are organizations that want to do business together, that are not anonymous to each other, then you suddenly realize you simplify the domain pretty tremendously. You don't have to use proof of work, for example. You can use simple Byzantine fault tolerance to guarantee that everybody has the right to write to that ledger. You can use a simple Merkle tree to guarantee that everyone's transactions are synchronized with everyone else, and you can prove that when you need to prove that. And you can also still retain a governance model that says, how we decide to permit entities onto the chain is a mix not only of technology, but also human governance that says, if there is a bad actor, somebody who is trying to spam the system with fraudulent transactions, right? Well, first off, we try to make sure certain types of fraud would never be possible with, prevention of double spend, that sort of thing baked in. But if somebody even was following the rules, able to write a smart contract that took advantage of something that leaked money, leaked data, leaked assets, or leaked personal information, and we didn't have any chance to pull that back, then you'd have something that no smart contract could do, which is bind the parties to a corrective action of some sort, bind them to something that fixed. And that's the whole premise of the Hyperledger project, is to build technologies that go and build this kind of distributed ledger smart contract space. We don't know what the answers are. We know that right now we're at a Cambrian explosion kind of moment. We've got to map all these different technologies.
And Hyperledger is member-based, so you have multiple members.
Right.
How many members do you have? What are they contributing? How many different blockchain implementations and other technologies are in various stages of growth within Hyperledger, and importantly, what is your role to sort of usher them through and help them each kind of find their own identity?
So we started about 2 years ago. It was announced in December 2015. I joined in June of last year, May of last year. We're at 170 different members now. About 20 of those are nonprofits and government associations. The rest are businesses. Most recently, Baidu joined us, which is kind of a cool. Oracle and Wipro, in some sense, the establishment has come over. Understand the concern about that. That's one type of constituency. We certainly, and an equal number, by the way, of startups. 40% of our members are based in Asia. So really interesting there, and they contribute funds, but they also contribute pathways into their organizations to get these technologies deployed. But I care as much about the real constituency that matters, which is the developers. And those are, in many cases, employees from these companies that are building the products and services and contributing to this underlying infrastructure. But in many cases, they are individuals, they're small companies. There's no barrier to somebody, whether you're a paid member or not, to be able to use the code, use it in production, create products and services, and contribute back in and become a core member of any one of the over 9 different projects now, or sorry, not over 9 different projects that we have right now within the Hyperledger project.
So give us a couple of names, those 9 projects. Who is contributing that code?
So the one that's passed to 1.0 is Hyperledger Fabric, and this was originally contributed by IBM. They've made a major investment in this, probably 40 FTEs, working on the code, enhancing it in various ways, but it's also had contributions from companies like State Street Bank, Huawei, Alibaba, startup companies like Hasera. These over half of the contributions now come from companies other than IBM. So for us, that's kind of a major milestone, is when you can say these are multi-stakeholder projects.
And Intel has contributed
Intel brought in another project, and again, initially, all these projects tend to start out as kind of homegrown kinds of things that then come in to get a wider audience. So Sawtooth Lake, they originally called it, just renamed Sawtooth, which has a novel consensus mechanism called proof of elapsed time, which you could kind of say is testimony of elapsed time, and it does depend upon the security of Intel's private key. So, but it does offer the potential for a consensus mechanism.
There are a total of 9 of these.
There's 9 different projects. Not all of them are DLT projects.
Okay.
There are some, for example, there's Hyperledger Burrow, which is an implementation of the Ethereum VM.
Before we go into too much more detail there, I just wanted to get a sampling of Hyperledger's membership there. Anybody here on stage that's a member of Hyperledger?
Actually, not yet.
Interesting, right?
Maybe someday.
So I did give Brian. I wanted him to really give a strong description of Hyperledger, knowing that no one else on stage is actually a member. And I think that's an interesting point to highlight, though. I'd like to start off by addressing Stefan directly. You recently kind of partially got affiliated a little bit with Hyperledger here. Could you talk to me a little bit about what it was that Ripple contributed to Hyperledger and the role that it may or may not play in helping these 9 potentially competing parties play nicely?
Yeah, so I want to give a little bit of background also, because we have like 4 very different viewpoints, I think, represented on stage, and kind of how we think about how we think about dealing with this incredible versatility of use cases. Kind of Vitalik's talked to this fact that like everyone's creating their own blockchain with their own business case and idea behind it and reasoning behind it. And I definitely recognize that same problem. I think we all do as a problem. And so it's interesting to look at the different approaches. And you've kind of heard Vitalik talk about, we want to have a blockchain that's programmable so we can have these different use cases all live together on one blockchain. With the Hyperledger approach, where we're standardizing, we're kind of experimenting, doing these different implementations, and then seeing like which one everyone gravitates towards, and building a standard through software. And I think the third approach that's sort of represented here on stage is what we call interledger protocol, which is essentially the idea that you have different implementations, and they are running very separately. But then if they need to pay each other, if they need to interact with each other, there's sort of defined protocols with how they do that. And I want to explain a little bit how we arrived at that approach and why we were sort of led that way. And that basically goes back to, again, my Bitcoin days, where even like a simple feature was sort of a big battle to get through, because you had to kind of get everyone on board, had to everyone to agree that the risk was worth it. I remember one particular feature, pay to script hash, which was kind of being rolled out at the time that I was very active in the community. And I noticed that it took a lot longer than any of us predicted to actually get it rolled out into production. And in retrospect, that makes sense because a lot of people's money is at stake. You're working on a running system. Somebody compared it to, building or maintaining an airplane while it's in the air flying, at 100, whatever speed airplanes fly at. You can tell I'm a blockchain expert, not an airplane expert. But big props to people who are. But what I want to say about this approach is, has anyone here heard of this project called Project Xanadu? I just want to show of hands. Has anyone heard of this? Yes, you have. Okay. So you can tell it's not a very technical audience, but I'll explain why it's important. It's a project started by a fellow named Ted Nelson, and he's best known for inventing packet switching, which is the technology that underlies the internet. And he actually had an idea for an application for the internet, which might sound very familiar. He wanted to have something where people could share documents, and documents could refer to other documents. You'd kind of click on links and get from one document to the other.
This is in the early 70s, too.
Yes.
To put together the timing.
Yeah, good point. Time component there.
Well, it's actually, a lot of people don't know this, but it's still ongoing, this project. It's not gained much adoption, and many people would say that the web has made it obsolete. But here's the reason of why things played out the way that they did. And Xanadu, like you said, it was started all the way back in the 70s, and it's sort of been in development ever since. And I think one of the things that's really been limiting for this project is that it was a very highly integrated system. So one of the nice things about Xanadu is that links are actually bidirectional. So unlike on the web where links can break, on Xanadu that can't really happen because everything's sort of synchronized together, and you would see if there was a link that would be broken by you taking a page down. But that also means that everything has to be aware of everything else in the network. So it's sort of a mutual codependence within the network. And I realized that the thing that made Bitcoin so hard to update was a similar sort of mutual codependence between Bitcoin nodes. If I change how my Bitcoin node works, that has a potential impact on yours. Or worst case, we sort of fork off, and we're no longer part of one network. We no longer can interoperate. We no longer can transact with each other. So that's happened many times in the case of like Bitcoin Cash, for instance. I can no longer send money between those two networks. And so I thought about why did this not pose a problem for the web? Or how does the internet, the web, solve this problem? And what I realized was that there are protocols essentially that abstract away the differences between networks. So on the internet, you might have a satellite network, you might have a Wi-Fi network, and they use different standards, and those standards can be very complex. But they're abstracted away by the internet protocols, which sort of overlay all of that. And so what we realized was that no matter what use case you have, ultimately, the best platform is going to be the platform that you design for that use case. And so the problem that needs solving is the interoperability. If I have my insurance contract and you have your wallet contract, how do I pay from my system to yours, even though they might use different technologies? I might have used different vendors. I might have used one project over another. And so that's kind of the problem. That's how we frame the problem. And so our answer to that was creating a protocol for interoperability. And so now to tie it back to your question, sorry for the very long-winded answer, but to tie it back to your question, the reason we're engaging with Hyperledger is because we want to make sure that there's sort of these protocols that are supported by many different blockchains, so that people have a lot of choice, and there's a lot of competition in the economy where people can choose a solution that's best for them. We also yesterday the Gates Foundation announced this project called Mojaloop, which is another project that sort of adopted Interledger protocol, and that's a project that's targeted at mobile money operators, and a lot of them wouldn't even use blockchain at all. So it's really important to create not just the interoperability within our industry that's represented here on stage, but actually deeper into the financial industry with lots of different solutions that may not all be blockchain-based.
So we've been talking so far a lot about the competition, and as you can tell, it's typically a relatively friendly competition. It's one of the bizarre things about being a business journalist in this space is I think it's the interoperability thing has kind of made it so that everyone who's building has a future at which time they might at some point connect. And I feel like there's this foresight, maybe I shouldn't be too mean to this person because 20 years from now we're going to interoperate, right? But there is, of course, there is a real competition that's going on. That's sort of a fight for users, and I even am reluctant to call them customers because a lot of these protocols are open source, and so they're not even charging for them, at least right out of the can. Tom, could you kind of, first of all, walk us through who you imagine when you imagine Chain's customers, or to put that another way, what is or are the use cases that you have identified? And as you are going from customer to customer to customer, what are you seeing, where are they telling you the maturity of the industry is?
Yeah, great question. So I think, we're a commercial software provider. We work with customers to deliver solutions that deliver value to their businesses. And so you know, a lot of our focus is on incumbents that have latent network effect opportunities. A prime example being Visa, 17,000 banks in their credit card network. They've just, well, not just, about a year ago announced the instantiation of a high-value payments network that would sit on top of that, not on top of the credit card network, but leverage the same settlement rails as the credit card infrastructure. And that's interesting because as someone who comes from finance, and now someone who's working in a technology industry that's predominantly focused on financial applications, at least what we're doing and others, it's never really the technology that is the last mile problem. It's the fact that in Visa's case, they have counterparty relationships with 17,000 financial institutions. And as someone who worked at a large investment bank, that's always the hardest problem in terms of scaling these networks. So coming back to the, let me come back to the interoperability question for a minute from more of a business perspective, and then I'll dive into what our customers are telling us. Interoperability is an interesting one for me because from a technical standpoint, I really like the idea that we can kind of develop this new financial fabric where networks can talk to one another and with all the attendant benefits of that. Having said that, there's very little of that in the current financial services industry. Creating these industrial network effect businesses are difficult. When you think about the New York Stock Exchange or NASDAQ or even SWIFT, it's hand-to-hand combat over months and years to build the network. And again, it's never really the technology, it's lots of other things. So I don't necessarily see, I see that developing around certain software ability, and I think ultimately the interoperability is driven by the customers of those networks, as opposed to there being a competitive landscape where people who've invested a lot of money in these networks, wouldn't it be great if we connected together? In institutional finance, if you think about these markets, we've got the fixed protocol. It's a standard interoperability between exchange reg NMS, but it's interoperability. And so I think, my central case assumption, I can clearly be wrong, is that from a financial standpoint, you need the network where you can think about the interoperability. In terms of our customers, so we're going after clients that can deliver networks. So Visa is an example, NASDAQ is another. The idea of using a blockchain-based data record for their business. And so that's new insurance companies, consumer lending companies space that like the idea of having a blockchain in the future or the ability to have cryptographic security, shareability, immutability, but they recognize that to go from them as a small organization or medium-sized organization to one that scales to a large network is going to take time. So they're making these technology choices now around blockchain, hoping to develop the network, but the network is not the necessary condition for them to launch the business in the first place. They can achieve that without blockchain technology. And that's an interesting development for us and I think for the space, and that's something that we're starting to see with more frequency while we chase some of the bigger network opportunities.
Do any of your customers view each other as competitors, and is there any hesitation for a competitor to be building on the same platform as another competitor?
I think it's still reasonably early. I think the contrary, without getting into too much detail, we delivered a network for Citi, we delivered one for NASDAQ. Those two networks now talk to one another. So folks that are transacting in the private securities market in NASDAQ can use Citi's payment services to effectively settle those transactions on NASDAQ's network. And so we actually see over time more opportunity to federate these networks together. As opposed to them being directly competitive. I think from a business selection standpoint, we wouldn't want to put ourselves in those types of situations. We're more looking for how can we create more virality, more of a network effect by getting our customers to talk to one another. So there's a bit of curation in terms of who we want to work with, quite frankly.
Vitalik, I can't even begin to imagine how you must view competition. There's so many different applications that you have had little or nothing to do with directly that are competing for funds and competing for donors on the protocol that you created. What do you think about this idea of a federation of blockchains? Is that something that Ethereum is interested in doing? Do you see a little bit more of a complicated answer to that? What do you think about these gentlemen to your left? Are they competitors or friends?
I would say friends more than competitors. In general, I think blockchain interoperability is definitely something that is very important. And the key insight that makes that true is basically just the simple fact that it's not possible that everything's going to be on one blockchain. Right? So, there's good reasons to use Ethereum, there's good reasons to use a private chain of one type, there's good reasons to use a consortium chain of another type, and possibly you want the consortium chain of the other type to be audited by the Ethereum public chain in some way, so there's lots of hybrid options in the middle, and there are very often good technical reasons for a lot of this. You might want certain kinds of features. You might want speed of consensus. You might want your transactions to confirm in 500 milliseconds, which no public chain is ever going to do, just because of the laws of physics. You might want different levels of expressivity. You might want different consensus algorithms. And it turns out that with a lot of these blockchain interoperability options, you actually can get many of the benefits of both, right? You can get both the speed benefits of a chain where the consensus is run by like a few high-powered nodes, at the same time as, let's say, using a system like Plasma to basically audit the blockchain and kind of keep it honest using the public chain as a form of backing. You might want to have digital assets that are based in one chain be usable in another chain. You might want like contracts that are on one chain to be able to send funds to other chains. So like there are going to be plenty of use cases for this kind of interaction. And I think the nice thing about blockchains as an environment is that if you set the thing up correctly, then not only do you have the potential for very high interoperability, but you even have the potential for permissionless interoperability, right? So there have already been at least like 2 projects that have tried to connect the Ethereum blockchain to other chains, and they've done this in the kind of proper like crypto-economic way where they're actually cryptographically proving the state of one blockchain to other chains. So you have BTC Relay, you have Peace Relay, and neither of these projects required A, permission from myself, B, permission from the developers of any other Ethereum client, C, permission from the Ethereum Foundation, or even D, any feature in the Ethereum protocol that's specifically designed for that. So once you have a platform which is computationally powerful enough, and if you have a platform where the consensus is open enough and cryptographically verified enough, then you have a platform on which interoperability can just happen as a thing that you do on top. So the possibilities really are quite large.
So
Actually, just to reinforce your point, Vitalik, for Interledger, we collaborated with some members of the Ethereum community and also built an integration for the Interledger protocol. And to your point, like we didn't need your permission, so there's a very good advantage of this type of block.
how many different ledgers are going through Interledger right now?
So we did a demo just a few months ago in Berlin where we connected 7 different ledgers, including 2 that are represented here. So big props to the chain team who we work with. Actually, one of the better SDKs that we've seen for blockchain systems. We haven't integrated any Hyperledger projects yet, but that's going to happen very soon, I imagine. And then we had the Ethereum as well as XRP Ledger, a central ledger that we built as a stand-in for something like a PayPal, as well as payment channel implementation for Bitcoin. So it was kind of a wide variety of ledgers that was represented in that test.
So Stefan, if you're playing so well with everybody on stage here today, who is the competition?
There's a really good question. So I think that you have to kind of distinguish between some of the different things that we're all interested in, right?
Stefan, who is the competition?
I'll get to that. I'm trying to give people understanding more than sound bites. So there's sort of the competition between. There's sort of the competition. There's sort of the competition between currencies, as Vitalik just pointed out, and there's the competition between sort of interoperability protocols. And when you talk about currencies, you kind of have to pick one or the other. Either you have your money in XRP or you have your money in dollars. So these are clearly, in some level, competitive. But on the other hand, when you're talking about
You didn't take that one, huh?
No, and I wouldn't either because it's too early right now for us to. I mean, this is not a zero-sum game. As a developer, come up to speed on a mix of the different technologies in an hour and a half on each of them. No reason as a developer you shouldn't actually have kind of a portfolio approach. Pick one and start investigating and exploring it. Each of these technologies are changing enough over the next couple of years. The 2.0 of your production system, you are going to be changes in the underlying technology anyways, and blockchain project is going to be portable to the new platform because it's actually more in the business process. It's more in the figuring out who you want to do business with. And these details are not going to matter in the long term. Between the different.
Why?
Yeah, it's a wonderful chair, actually. Clearly late for most people, but as far as backers go, I think it was. And I was really just taken with the transformational ability of the technology. competitive battle lines, not to sound too trite. I do think it's old and new. It's the walled gardens with financial intermediaries as the connectors between those walled gardens versus type of future where there's some ability to transact anonymously with different protocols and different instruments. In one of the time that I could not, I said to myself, I would regret not doing this, and it's been an amazing 6 months. And so, is that we want to work with incumbents. We have worked with incumbents. It is a benefit in some respects. And again, it's just about the technology. Coming back to my banking roots, I think that in many cases the technology is there. You things that that have been successful in their respective worlds. Certainly, the whole ICO craze and these ERC20 tokens has been not to pursue.
Pick up on that concept of the old guard versus the new guard. Vitalik, would you care to elaborate?
Joking, but the point is, I think that the new, like financial world and parts of the new for it, and like I do think that, and I will kind of that I think it's more about competing with ideas. If some banks end up
Panelists, and second of all, open it up to the audience. Take the first stab. The gentleman right here.
I just want to know, Vitalik, from your perspective, how
I don't think such a thing as a typical day for me. No, most of the day talking to researchers, and part of the day talking to researchers online, and the 2 days before that I was at the ETH Waterloo Hacker, and there were a lot of interesting projects happening there. Added a whole bunch of new cryptography and privacy features, so that
another time in history in development of technology or in ideology, what would you development?
The early days of the web are the easy. Both the mix of optimism and you put a fact on a page, you can always provide a reference for that fact. That means we'll do away with incorrect information, right? Didn't quite work that way, right? On that, we won't need the media industry anymore. On pretty much every business, right? And a lot of were dramatically remade. I think the questions that also come out of that are, what is the right metaphorical to blockchain technology? Is it to TCP/IP? Is it to HTTP, or is it to kind of HTML? And HTML is kind of a mess right now. It's kind of, innovation kind of looks like that from time to time, right? Where winnowing effect, right? And I think right now we are in a Cambrian explosion kind of moment where the industry can support a lot of ideas, mapping the terrain, and at some point the asteroid will hit, or resources get a bit more scarce, and we'll have to work together a bit more closely than we do in kind of winnowing down to a couple of common standards. But right now, I think the environment favors trying every idea, looking at other consensus mechanisms, looking at other smart contract languages, and figuring out organically what does the architecture of that look like. And if we all do our job well, it can take place over a few years rather than a generation, like often happens in other tech. Oh, that's a good question. I have no idea. Maybe it's when the first sovereign currency gets issued in some sort of cryptocurrency, or something that looks like a crypto but isn't. We'll see. But that could be one of the signals around which of these technologies is preferred, at least at scale.
I agree with that. I would say if you're looking at this from more of a financial markets lens, I think the step towards electronic trading and automation of trading that started in the late 90s. And I think what's interesting about this time around is it's also automation of the back office, right? So we can now trade in milliseconds for cents on the dollar, but it still takes 3 days and lots of people to reconcile and clear a trade. So I think you're going to see that sort of automation go through the entire stack. So I agree with the web analogy. I also think that the late 90s, early 2000s in most asset classes is instructive if you're coming from more of a financial perspective.
I was thinking the trebuchet. That was a
Fire, the invention of fire.
sir. Oh, I'm sorry. Right over here.
I think a lot of the audience are in the payment space here today. So, and we also know that a lot of the central banks are trying to explore, put the fiat currency on the blockchain. And like Singapore, Bank of Canada's tried, Bank of England. So if a central bank is going to pick one of you as implementation, who do you think would be the best fit?
I think they'll do it on Dogecoin. Like seriously though, I think that just from my personal discussions and with central banks and just reading on what they've been up to, I mean there have actually been quite a lot of pilots on Ethereum, though that practically speaking doesn't mean too much in practice because these are ultimately all test projects, right? So far there is nothing close to a central bank issued digital currency that's being launched because people don't even fully understand what the economic model is, right? So for example, one idea that governments sometimes bring up is using a cryptocurrency internally to basically track government revenue and all the way to government expenses and kind of prevent money from disappearing and limit corruption. There's other people that want to use it as like a Clearmatics as a settlement coin project inside of a financial derivative system. There's people that want to try to get this adopted for payments in some way. So I think that it's I'm not expecting to see any kind of large scale actual live central bank digital currency trial for at least, or not trial, actually launched for another few years. And if it is, then I guarantee you that it'll basically be a server with a bunch of marketing buzzwords that make it look like a blockchain.
Is it Vitalik? Is it strange to you that to hold up the a piece of fiat currency as the competition, and then to be consulting with central banks?
Hold on. So fiat currency has a few different parts to it, right?
Okay.
One of them is the idea that you have paper cash and you give paper cash to people, and this is how you transfer value. Then there is the actual unit of account / medium of exchange as a unit, which is a completely separate thing. And fiat is quite good at doing some things like delivering price stability, though I think the fact that there exists a class of currencies other than fiat currencies now that people can widely use is also definitely something that's going to be very important and valuable. So I guess for me it's as a general statement, it's first and foremost about the technology, and second, and more specifically, it's about the technology kind of in its capacity as a platform on top of which lots of these different ideas actually can get tried out at low cost, and we can see what kinds of ideas make sense.
I'll open that up to the rest of the panel. What are your thoughts on legacy financial institutions experimenting and adopting blockchain technology? Anyone who's been watching social media for the last 24 hours has seen some very visceral reactions against Swift experimenting with blockchain technology. I'll be the second person to say Swift on stage today. If you look at Swift not as an entity in itself, but as a sort of representative of the larger legacy financial institutions, would you guys be sad if all the financial institutions went to blockchain and you were left not doing it yourself? Or would it be considered the ultimate success to see legacy institutions adapt the technology?
Let's talk about what Swift is first.
Okay.
Right? Swift is not a for-profit company that has big revenues and pays out huge dividends to a small number of shareholders. They're a co-op that are owned by their member banks, right? But shareholder interest for them is not maximizing rent by charging extreme amounts for payments that flow. They're actually the fees to send payments across Swift are actually really low. It's their shareholder interest is moving from T+3 days to T+5 minutes, right? And so in some respects, they're kind of perfectly positioned to say, if we can reinvent how we do core messaging or other things from a message hub kind of model to one where they're more like a referee on a football field, right? Where they say, here's the rules of the game. You're all allowed to come in. We'll prevent double spend, do other kinds of systematic ways of preventing fraud. But fundamentally, you can't keep someone whose credentials were stolen from not having a way to correct against fraud perpetrated in their name. Like, you need that kind of governance. Then they'll do something interesting. They'll transform themselves. If they don't seize it, there's lots of others kind of waiting in the wings to take that over. DTCC similarly. I think, happily or sadly, a lot of the establishment banks will get it because they have internalized the need to be technology companies first. Technology companies that occasionally touch assets in one way or another, right? It's perhaps in other sectors, the legacy healthcare companies, for example, or the legacy intermediaries in the supply chain world that may be more vulnerable to being completely kind of replaced.
Stefan, what do you think? Would legacy adoption of blockchain be an ultimate success or a victory in your eyes?
I think the question kind of presupposes that blockchain is somehow like an inherently superior solution to every other possible way of doing something. I think that's completely wrong. I think that there might be use cases where blockchain is extremely beneficial, where you have multiple parties that have mutual distrust, for example, or you have a great need for transparency or something like that. You might really want to go for blockchain. But to the gentleman's question earlier, we did a test with the Bank of England, and now the Bank of England is not particularly known for being an untrustworthy institution, arguably. As a result, I think banks don't have a huge problem with using them as a counterparty. And to Vitalik's point, like, I expect them to make more of a central server. And so the result of that study wasn't to say that, all central banks should immediately switch to blockchain-issued tokens, but rather to say that they should think about how their system can interoperate with other systems. And again, I always go back to the same point of, like, use blockchains where they're appropriate, but then there are other approaches that are appropriate for certain situations when you care more about speed, when you care more about efficiency, ease of maintainability, security, whatever the case may be. And so choose the right solution and just make sure everything's interoperable.
Tom, anything you want to add on that point?
No, I agree with that, and I think that it is a technology choice. Every use case is not may or may not require the use of a blockchain. I think adoption by legacy institutions would be great, certainly for shareholders of those institutions, for financial inclusion, for building a better financial system and reducing friction. So,
would it be good for shareholders of those institutions for them to?
Well, because I think you just think about folks in this audience and at the SWIFT conference, just the amount of money that's spent just processing and reconciling payments, and that extends to derivatives. It extends to other financial instruments. It extends to payments that merchants are getting that they need to reconcile against various credit card networks and other other platforms. So I think that there's a benefit in doing that. I think the challenge is that getting it implemented is difficult. Getting it out of the innovation lab is hard, and that takes will, it takes capital, and it takes more years than most banks typically think about from an investment return horizon. So that's one of the things we all have to think about and work on.
Any other audience questions? Yes, sir.
Hi. Well, first of all, I work in a bank, just for a start. From the point of view of...
You're forgiven.
Of a person. Thank you. Thank you very much. From the point of view of a person that works in a bank, looking at the people now on stage, I'd say that probably when we work on Ethereum, we may actually like a lot the idea of this decentralized computer where we can run applications, but we are actually worried about issues like privacy or potential scalability for our business. When we look at private blockchains, we actually like how they actually address these points, while on the other end, the issue is that they do not look enough like a blockchain, if you understand what I mean. They don't have a digital currency, they don't have that way of settling things that blockchain have introduced. So my question is, aren't you actually seriously thinking or working on the possibility of merging the two approaches in such a way that in what we could call layer 2 or state channels, actually private blockchains use public blockchains like Ethereum as a form of let me call it settlement platform, even if it is an old word? Thank you.
I mean, well, first of all, you've basically described the point of Plasma. So, we are working on things that almost exactly try to fill that particular need, and that's in part because it is a need that we have really recognized. Because on the one hand, public chains are totally unsuitable for a whole bunch of applications because number one, throughput, and number two, privacy challenges. Now, of course, we are working on other forms of public chain scalability, and we are working on other forms of privacy, such as some of the the zero knowledge proof stuff that we just released in Byzantium yesterday. But even beyond that, like there, at least in today's technology, like private chains do have a lot of value in some cases. But at the same time, we've been finding that the people that try to build private chains often end up, like after 1 or 2 years trying to build something, basically come crawling back to like wanting to have some kind of public chain component because they realize that if they don't do that, then it's just too hard to shake off the impression of, oh, I'm just building yet another centralized empire. Please become my vassal. And like that's, and so like the kind of hybrid solution in the middle actually is this sort of niche that like a lot of people want, and that is so. Look, I will say there are multiple development teams that are working on making this kind of thing in reality, a reality. So like Plasma, for example, has at least 2 teams. There is a company called L4 that's starting to be looking at the state channel stuff. There's another few companies that are doing state channel applications.
Give me one more and I can do an article.
I suppose there are Ethereum zone sharding efforts. Here's one. Quorum announced a zero knowledge proof integration, and we have a zero knowledge proof integration, the actual hard forks in Byzantium, but a compiler that lets you make basically encrypted smart contracts as coming out in a limited form in DEF CON. So there are really things that are happening. Yeah, the space in 2017 is like way ahead of what the space was in 2014, back when we were just talking about this.
Very cool.
All right, we have
Another one
time
over
for
here?
just 2 more questions, and we have to wrap up.
Hi. So I'm a VC mainly working in China last 20 years, an entrepreneur. So we've seen a lot of wealth created globally, but especially the speed in China. I'm learning blockchain, and one of the interesting things that attracted me is really this whole decentralization, democratization of it. So outlier question. The speed and the amount of money created in blockchain, in the cryptos, is quite scary. First question, does it scare you? And how concentrated the money is being held? Not just in ICOs, but really, certainly the panel sitting here. Is it a concern? Second question is, how does grandma, at this point, sooner than later, if we believe blockchain is the future, that it will create wealth for everyone, how does grandma participate today?
I think it's really just for Vitalik.
Yeah. So for this, so first of all, today, I expect the answer may well be that grandma should not participate. So the fact is that blockchains are currently not user-friendly enough for very large categories of people, and I would definitely not recommend that people put money into funny speculative crypto tokens if they don't deeply understand what they are and how they work. So it's ultimately, we're at the point where we have a lot of institutional hype, as like said over and over again, but we are still quite far from the point where blockchains actually can reach many millions and billions of people. And I personally think that the primary bottlenecks that we need to solve in order to reach the millions and millions of people actually are the technical ones. So number one, scalability. So like Ethereum with a Metropolis just upgraded from being able to do about 6 transactions a second to being able to do a whopping 9 or 10 transactions a second. Uber does 10. PayPal does 1,200, Visa does somewhere between 2,000 and 30,000. So we need to get much higher. Number 2, privacy. Number 3, usability and security. And I do combine those 2 together because I think in the blockchain space it really is about how do we make security usable and how do we make usability secure. And these problems are going to get solved over the next few years in various ways, in some places and in some industries and areas earlier than others. But technologically, they are going to get solved. And as they get solved, yes, the technology is going to become usable and capable of providing value for more and more people. So there are, my general answer for institutions, for example, is now is a very good time to be analyzing what you can do with blockchain technologies and doing experiments and tests. And in some cases, now is a good time to launch applications. In many other cases, 2 years from now is a good time to launch applications. If you're an individual, then now is, depending on the kind of an individual you are, now is the time to learn, get interested, see if you can get involved. And if you are interested in the space just in your capacity as a potential user, then it may well be the case that things that are useful enough for you to use are still 2 to 4 years away. That is totally fine.
To wrap things up, I'll piggyback that question for everybody to give a closing word here. Brian, what is now a good time for?
if you're a company at all that is dealing with transactions and who doesn't, right? To have yourself or your developers starting to understand this landscape, starting to play with it. I mean, but many of you probably are even past that point. Building these things, there's no such thing as a ledger of one, a distributed ledger of one. So try to find other companies that you do business with who also want to see how do you transform kind of how you do business through this, and build a pilot, take it to production if it seems to be working. But don't just sit back and wait for somebody else to give you an answer here. It's not, you don't have the luxury of that.
Stefan, what is now a good time for?
Yeah, I guess as the oldest of the projects represented here, we've kind of gone down the rabbit hole a bit further, and for instance, the Ripple XRP ledger currently processes up to 1,500 transactions per second. So that's kind of state of the art for blockchain, and I think that our experience has been that it's not purely a technical challenge. I think that there are technical challenges that the blockchains have to address, but there's also sort of a deeper governance issue, and I kind of alluded to this a little bit earlier when I was talking about the Bitcoin feature, pay to script hash, but basically, you have these systems where every little decision has to go through everybody, and so I think that we have to fundamentally rethink that architecture and actually think of blockchains not as this entirely separate category, but as a spectrum all the way from centralized to a little bit decentralized, a little bit more decentralized, and so on. Pick the right thing for the use case, and then have interoperability across. So I think where I'm coming from is less people should less be thinking about how to replace my system with a blockchain. That doesn't necessarily make it any better, any faster, or any better for your users, but rather think about how do you connect your system to other systems out there. So don't think about blockchain as the next evolution, but rather as the thing that raised the question about interoperability.
Tom, what is now a good time for?
A drink. That was too obvious. I had to. Sorry.
Yeah, exactly.
Sorry, it was really gratuitous. That was great. I got the most applause of any of you guys.
See, no competition
that was your answer,
at all, right?
Okay. No, I think it's time to take, I think the technology's gotten to a point, and I think more importantly, the institutional understanding of the technology's gotten to a point where it's time to take things out of the innovation lab and try to get things into production, test the go-to-market strategy, test the business model, see if your return on investment thesis is correct, and continue to experiment, because as the other panelists have said, the technology will continue to evolve over a reasonably long period of time, and that's not a reason not to start doing things.
Rock and roll. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, panel.
Thank you very much to our panel.
Well done.
Michael, Ryan, Stefan, Vitalik, Tom, thank you again for the panel. Obviously, a super thought-provoking conversation, something that's be relevant for payments not only today, but for years and years to come. So thanks again to the panel. We're going to soon be transitioning from blockchain rock stars to honest-to-goodness real rock and roll stars with the Steve Miller Band. But before that, here, please, come on down, guys. Before that, just a couple of things. We're hoping that you guys enjoyed the second day of Swell. We obviously had a all-star panel up after you guys, bringing together technology, bringing together banking, bringing together regulatory, all in one forum. So we have one more day tomorrow. Join us for our happy hour in just a second, and then please also be joining us later for our celebration with the Steve Miller Band. Thanks a lot.